Okay. Or mail voting population when planning for elections during the coronavirus pandemic. As part of our clearinghouse function, we are posting these interviews with our other coronavirus materials on our website, eac.gov. This discussion will focus on how officials at the county level can adjust and prepare for an increase in mail voting. I would like to welcome and introduce our guests, both of whom I've had the privilege of working with. First is David Stafford. David Stafford has served as a Escambia County Supervisor of Elections since November of 2004. He's a graduate of the University of Florida. Stafford is also the past president of the Florida State Associations of Supervisors of Election and current legislative chair of the National Association of Election Officials. Following the designation of elections as critical infrastructure by the Secretary of Homeland Security, Stafford was asked to serve on the sector's Government Coordinating Council as one of 9 local election officials from across the country. He's helped author the communications and information sharing protocols for threats and incidents affecting the election sector, which was adopted in 2018. My other guest will be Julie Marcus. She's the Chief Deputy of the Supervisor of Elections Office of Pinellas County since 1999. In 2002, she joined that office and she has developed and managed the Voter Outreach Department. In 2005, she was promoted to the Election Services Coordinator position, which is largely responsible for polling place operations. In 2007, Marcus was selected to serve on the Citizens Advisory Committee that was tasked with making a recommendation to the Pinellas Board of County Commissioners on an optical scan voting system. In May of 2012, Deborah Clark appointed Marcus as the Chief Deputy. Over her 17-year career with the Supervisor of Elections, Marcus has administered 300 municipal elections, 21 countywide elections, including 13 machine recounts, 12 manual recounts, 35 post-election manual audits, and implemented 2 new voting systems. Well, welcome to both of you. I appreciate you coming to talk about this important issue. We're going to talk a little bit about how your offices has handled the increase of absentee vote by mail ballots over the years, and some of your advice to counties and localities on how they may prepare for an influx of absentee votes this year and coming years. With that, my first question is I'm going to ask each of you to talk a little bit about the percentage of voters who cast ballots by mail in your county. Tell me a little bit about your county generally, and then what guidance and practices have you implemented with regard to handling an increased number of absentee or mail ballots in your office?
Julie?
Thank you, Commissioner. So Pinellas County is the largest county in the state of Florida. We have about right now 680,000 registered voters. During the course of a given year, we have about 42% who have mail ballot requests on file, but that increases significantly as we get closer to elections. For our general elections since 2010, over 50% of the ballots that are cast in an election are cast by mail. And then in our primaries and municipal elections, it over 70%. We are the largest mail ballot county in the state of Florida without an all mail ballot election state.
David?
Sure. Well, good morning to you. Welcome back to Florida. So we're considered a medium-sized county in the state of Florida. We got about 215,000 registered voters. Historically, we've been right at about 25% of our votes cast in any given election, plus or minus a couple of percentage points, are vote by mail. We do have, as you know, we do have a large Yokava population, so that takes up some sizable chunk of that. But for instance, what we just saw in the 2020 presidential preference primary was actually that jumped from 26% in 2016 to 38% in this election. I think there was two reasons. I don't think you can attribute all of it to the situation that we found ourselves in on the 17th of March. We actually, if you indulge me here for a second, we actually sent out a mailer, and this was sort of fortuitous that we did this. We had historically done a mailer that, and it was just a postcard that directed people either to our website or to our phone number to request a vote by mail ballot. This time, to try to push a little bit more of a response rate, we actually included, as you can see, a tear-off sort of business reply. And we actually had some pretty good success in building our vote by mail request numbers. Like I said, we hover around 25%. I think that it seems obvious to me that in these elections, the next two elections we're going to have, it'll be well over that. Exactly what that number looks like, I'm not sure. We have started to see an uptick again in your vote by mail applications. I think one of the good things about Florida is the application process, as opposed to other states, is very easy. There's multiple ways that an individual can request a vote by mail ballot, to include simply picking up the phone or calling, or we have online forms on our website. I think it's we're no excuse. I think I don't know if that's been said yet. We're no excuse state, so that it facilitates a lot of vote by mail activity throughout the state.
If I may, Commissioner.
Go ahead. Yes.
To go back to kind of what David was saying is Pinellas County, so we recognized in 2008 that you shouldn't assume anything. Laws change all the time, and we saw that, voters may have not known that, like David said, that Florida was no excuse absentee state. So the first thing we stopped saying was absentee ballot. We started calling them mail ballots or vote by mail, because the idea of using the word absentee implies you're not around. So recognizing this, we really encouraged our voters to look at their 3 voting options, and we encouraged voters to consider these types of messages like vote in the comfort of your own home, take advantage of the convenience of voting by mail. And when we started this in January of 2008, we were at 44,000 mail ballot requests, and within 4.5 years, we had increased over 600%, where we were mailing out 309,000 requests for the 2012 general election. So that kind of messaging, our voters took advantage of it, and they embraced the option of voting by mail. It's convenient, it's easy. And now with COVID, you have another reason that voters can take into consideration, which is the safety of themselves, their families, and others. So I think this is a really good topic, and I'm glad that EAC is bringing this to the attention of other election administrators to prepare for what they've got coming up this fall.
Hey, Don, can I one more quick thing? The other thing, just for folks that may not be familiar with our 2 counties, Pinellas, and correct me if I'm wrong, Julie, but Pinellas, I think at one time was the most densely populated county in the state.
Yes, sir.
And so, you think about the more densely populated, the more difficult it is to find suitable polling locations to get people through the process versus counties that may have a little bit more land mass, a little bit, more opportunities for people to go out and find polling places. So certainly Deb and Julie were ahead of their time in pushing vote by mail. They actually, she won't say it, but I will, they took some arrows over the years from people that criticized them for not having a number of the same number, a larger number of early voting locations over the years, but that was just a method that their voters tended to prefer, and certainly I think it certainly I would think helped in this situations like this and moving forward into the fall and fall elections.
And David, thank you. I appreciate that, because Mail ballots, again, increase access, which is what elections are all about, is increasing voter turnout. And these aren't emotional decisions. This was all data-driven decision-making. We looked at data, and had the data shown that voters weren't taking advantage of this opportunity, we would have made different decisions. But with that level of increase, we saw that not only did mail ballots increase voter turnout overall, but it crossed party lines, and was across demographics. So mail ballots are a really good way of giving voters direct access to the process. So yeah, we did take a lot of arrows, but the results are there. So it did work out for the voters, which is the goal.
So Julie and David, what would your advice be to other counties that are, they're going to be faced with increased absentee or mail ballots, depending on the state? What procedures would you advise them, having gone through the process, to handle those increased numbers?
So I'll take that. And again, this is great. You have sort of two, I wouldn't say opposite ends of the spectrum here, but it's all a scale. It's all about scale. The other thing you have to remember about Florida is you have everything from Miami-Dade County with, I think there are, 1.2 million voters now, down to Lafayette County. I think last time I checked, Lafayette had like 4,000 or 5,000 registered voters. So what works in one county, obviously the needs and concerns of Miami-Dade are going to be vastly different than Lafayette or Madison or Washington or Holmes counties. Certainly there's some commonalities there, but just a big urban center versus a less populated rural county, you can't apply everything across the board and expect the same results. So we're in a process where our procedures are mostly internal, which is, I think, a little bit different than other counties who may contract out some of these services, at least the initial drop. I know that's become more of a popular option over the course of the past, I'd say 10 years. You've seen people trending towards engaging with a mail house or some specific vendor that does VBMs to handle that initial process, and sometimes throughout the length. We tried that once, and quite frankly, it didn't work for us. So we have we pulled it back in-house, but we have automated. So we've got to the point where, when I first got here, there was a lot of manual labor involved in preparing the vote by mail packages, sending them out, and then processing them upon return. We've automated a lot of that using kind of commercial folder insertion equipment. So the things that you'd see in the tax collector's office mailing out bills, or at the utility, something akin to that, but we have that internally, so we kind of control that. And then we do have automation on the back end as well. Again, it's not as robust as some of these other, just because we haven't scaled it up to that point, but we do have some automation on the back that reads the ballot in, clips the signature. And so I think the scale, as I'm sure you'll hear from Julie, their process is different because their scale is much larger. So, when you're talking about in a general election, a presidential general election, 50, 60,000 ballots, that's still a good number. So I would say that the first thing is make sure you have procedures in place. I think procedures through anything in elections, procedures are perhaps the most important thing. And particularly if you start getting in volume of returned ballots, making sure that you keep track of them. I mean, very basically, what you're sending out and what you're getting back. And then have procedures for how you process them. We tend to process ours in smaller batches, which it takes a little bit more time, but at the end of the day, it allows us to make sure we're keeping track with every vote by mail ballot that comes in, where it is in the process, whether it's been tabulated or not, and storage as well. So I think probably number one is making sure you have the right materials, the right equipment, and the right procedures and personnel in place on the front end. And don't minimize any of those. I could talk for 30 minutes on why it's important for the design of the materials. Both, you have to look at that because sometimes these are competing. The commercial folding insertion machine may have different requirements than the back end machine that reads the ballot, which may look different than what the USPS wants, which may not be conducive to all of the stuff we have to put on the outgoing and inbound envelopes that statutorily are required. So you got to balance all of that stuff out. So it's something that takes time. And, I know that folks like Pinellas who do this all the time, they're constantly changing and improving, as we try to do as well. I think as everybody else does in elections, look at what can we do better. The one thing I would say is you can't expect, I think, a jurisdiction, whether it's a state or a local jurisdiction, to go from virtually no vote by mail ballots to close to 100% vote by mail ballots and have everything, all the perfect procedures in place. That it's just, in a compressed time frame, it's not going to happen. So I think you got to sort of, as I've said, start with the blocking and tackling, making sure you can get envelopes, making sure you can get ballots, making sure you know how you're going to send them out, making sure you know what to do with them when they come back in. I mean, those are the basics. And then you can start, once you get that down, start working out in the outer rings on some of the other nice to haves. But those are the basics, at least in my opinion.
Julie, you have some input on what counties can do to prepare, large counties or other size county, but large counties may see a really big influx that they're not prepared for. And obviously being a large county in Florida, what would your advice be to them to prepare for additional mail voting?
I think what counties are going to be facing this fall is what are you going to be able to do before you have to do it? And then, of course, do as much as you can as soon as you can. So obviously what you're able to implement and test and make sure that you vetted is going to be based on your timelines. Like, how much time do you have? What directive or order are you going to be getting from the state possibly? What laws are going to be changing that are going to impact your operations? So let's just, so you have to start with that. And then, okay, from that, what can we get done that can help us implement this new process? So like, for example, the easiest that I can compare it to that, we went through a lot of growing pains from 2008 to now, but really 2008 to 2012, and David covered a lot of the things that I echo a lot of the things that he said, but one of the biggest growing pains was we went from a 1-card ballot to a 2-card ballot, and it significantly changed how we had to think about everything, which would be something that large counties will be facing. I mean, we're lucky. We've only had a small amount of elections where we've had a 3-card ballot, but you have, Miami-Dade and some other counties that have 1.2 million voters, and they have ballots that are 10 cards, 12 cards long. And imagine millions of pieces of paper. So every time you have a card, you double your request, so to speak. So in 2012, we had our first 2-card ballot, which we then had to reanalyze everything that we did. And again, like David said, think about every process from the beginning to the back end. So how, we had in October of 2012, we had 53,000 requests come in 1 month. So did we have enough people in the call center to handle those calls and to process email requests and requests that came in through the mail? That's number one. You have to get the ballots to the folks who are requesting them. And then do you have the staffing to, or the technology? Are you leveraging technology? Are you choosing to use a mailing system? Pinellas County couldn't get done what we do if we didn't have a mailing system. And I know that you wanted us to name vendors. So we use what is now known as Blue Crest, which is Pitney Bowes, which is a mailing system, the in-sorter and the sorter side. But if we didn't have that, could we get it done manually? Yes. Would it take multiple shifts and hundreds of people to get it done? Yes, we could do it. Prone to error? Yes. But a mailing system obviously is the best option if you can get that technology in your office. Another piece of technology that we've leveraged was ballot on demand. Because a pick and pull, when you're talking about hundreds of thousands of ballots, it makes for a very difficult process because you're literally picking and pulling per voter, and you're guessing on precincts on what you think people are going to be requesting, where a ballot on demand system allows for you to print literally what you need for that initial run and for your daily runs. So those systems also connect to our voter registration database. So you send that initial run, which is what we do. We send our initial run to our printing vendor in Arizona, which is Runbeck. And Runbeck prints our initial 280,000 mail ballot requests. They overnight a portion of them to us about 3 days before we have to mail out UOCAVA ballots. And then we, over time, they mail another 50, another 90,000 until they get to what we initially then mail out at 35 days before an election, which again is about 280,000 ballots. And then we do our daily run in-house. So again, you're only going to be able to do what you can do based on your timelines. Again, we've had a processes in place now for years, but get down into the minutia, use data, use time studies, literally sit people down with a stack of 50 ballots. How long does it take those folks to separate the certificate envelope from the, in the secrecy envelope with the ballot inside? How long does it take them to separate that? We've seen that we can do per person 100 of those per hour. Then you got to do the math. Then you have to take into consideration space and storage. How many ballots can you insert per hour? How many, then you need to take into consideration your election tabulation system. We use election system software, ES&S. How many scanners are you going to need to get the ballots processed timely? Florida has very tight deadlines. Go past noon on Wednesday tabulating ballots. So you have to make sure whether you're going to buy them or rent them, make sure you have enough scanners. For this election, knowing that in 2018, we had 5 statewide recounts going into 2020 as a purple state, we made sure we have now 6 scanners to ensure we can properly or timely, that is, process our mail ballots that we're going to have to get through the system in time. And make sure that your systems are set up in place, like your procedures are set up in place so that you are post-election ready. So when we had the 2-card ballot, we had to rethink everything. So down to reconciliation sheets and color coding boxes and marking our boxes that card 1 was yellow and card 2 was pink, so that we could keep things separated, so that if we ended up in a recount or if we don't have a manual recount, it requires a post-election audit, you can find those ballots quickly, again, because Florida has very tight deadlines. So you got to use your data, use time studies, take your ballot kits. This is something that's so important. David was talking about the materials like envelopes and such. You have other stakeholders besides your vendors, which include the United States Postal Service, which is an integral part of the process. You have to make sure that your insignias and your logos and all of this and your cutouts, all of it is where it's supposed to be. You obviously want to use the the best postage rate. So if you can use an inserter and sorter to be able to use intelligent mail ballot code, intelligent barcode. And then also on the sort side, you can sort down to a zip code level. You can use a nonprofit rate, which if you mark your ballot trays with the green tags, you can get your ballots processed first class mail. And then also make sure that you talk to your regional coordinators. We bring stacks of ballots down to our postal service centers, and we have them run the ballots through their Merlin scanners, systems to make sure that our ballots are being processed. We also, prior to mailing, test our actual ballots that we get back from the printers. We run them through our DS-850 to make sure that our ballots are counting, because the last thing you want to do is mail out 280,000 ballots and then find out that, oops, there was a problem, and you have to duplicate everything that comes back. So redundancies in the process, time studies, testing, everything that you can possibly do to mitigate errors, and do as much as you can as soon as you can.
That's very helpful, Julie. I think this will be very helpful for local election officials. So let's shift a little bit. We might come back to this. I think that a major question, particularly in this environment where we don't have a lot of time, like multiple cycles, talk to me about what type of education you have done and what you would maybe recommend. Perhaps we don't need a lot of education. Folks are obviously looking at what options they have, but do you have any guidance on what sort of options you would give voters about requesting their absentee in some states or mail ballots? Some have an online system that you can direct them to. Some do it by a paper application. Let's talk a little bit about this and what your recommendations are.
Yeah, I think that education is absolutely key, and that we should never assume anything as election administrators. I can speak that I've been in this for 17 years, and I'm still looking up voter law to make sure that I know, because laws change all the time. And voters, keep in mind, Florida is a very transient state, so we have a lot of voters from different states where laws are different. And there's a lot of myths that election administrators are constantly having to address in regards to mail ballots. One of my favorites is that we don't count them unless contests are close. So education is key. The bottom line is that you can, Florida, I can speak to Florida. Florida is a no excuse mail ballot state, meaning everybody can request a mail ballot. You can request that ballot, it gets mailed to you. You can vote in the comfort of your own home. If you choose to vote by mail and return it by mail, then give yourself a week to return that ballot so that it can be received timely. Make sure that voters understand the deadlines, that in Florida, domestic voters have to have those ballots back to us by 7 p.m. election day. And then we provide ballot drop-off locations through the Monday before the election. So that gives them another option. But I think that it's constant communication with our voters. It's always looking at those materials, as David referenced earlier, because you can always improve your processes. One of the biggest things is making sure, we have different laws now that address the ability to clear ballots if there's signature variation issues or no signatures, but you still don't want to have a voter have to go through that process. So you're looking at your return envelopes. Do we clearly state that, you must sign your ballot and it cannot be a power of attorney? How can we simplify our instructions? So educating voters on the process is absolutely key. And I don't think that can ever be set aside. No matter how long a voter has been voting, you got to keep hammering those points.
David.
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, I'll take them sort of separately. First is the request part of it, and letting voters know what their options are. I feel for states that have to have this big manual process of vote by mail requests, having to process those, because again, there's one thing that you can't get more of in elections, and that is time, right? So the more time that you have that is dedicated, and people that are dedicated towards processing a bunch of vote by mail requests, particularly as you get closer and closer to the election, any way to streamline that is going to be very helpful. So both from the election administrators end as well as the voters end, the easier you can make it for a voter to request their ballot, in my opinion, my personal opinion, what we've seen here in Florida, it helps facilitate that process. And I know there's different, the West, they're very comfortable with vote by mail balloting. Historically, the Southeast, for instance, is a little bit less enthusiastic about vote by mail ballots or absentees over the years. But if there's a dedicated shift towards there, you got to make sure you let voters know what their options are, and then how to go about how to facilitate those requests. Now, then, as far as educating them on the process of how to vote by mail, particularly, I think for us, I think a lot of our population has voted by mail historically, or at least somewhat familiar with it, versus, again, these other states that you may have had fewer than 10% of their votes that are cast by mail. It's a pretty big educational process, and I certainly would not minimize that. One thing that we have done over the course of the past few election cycles, is we've reached out to professionals out in the field, particularly the Center for Civic Design. We collaborated with them on a redesign of our envelopes a couple of years ago. We had to have it. We were doing it because there were some statutory changes, so we had to go through it anyway. And so I had been familiar with some of their work, and I reached out and said, "Hey, is this something you can help with?" And it was a very, very good experience. One of the challenges I will tell you, and Don, having served as the election director here in Florida and having dealt with the legislature, is that you've got and again, I think they're all well-intentioned, but you have legislators and staff that want to be very, very, very prescriptive in their statutory language. And they say, okay, it's got to say this. And even to the extent what you see here in statutory language in Florida is it's got to be all caps. It's got to be in bold. It's got to say exactly these, 15 paragraphs on how you look at it. You're like, there's no way a voter, number one, is going to read it. Number two, if they read it, they're going to understand it. So then what we got a little creative, because the first thing that they said when we sent them all of our materials, they're like, you got to rewrite all this stuff. And I'm like, I can't. You have to have this language because the statute says you have to have this very prescriptive language. So we basically included that. And then we said, okay, here's the simplified version. And here are the 5 or 6 things you really need to know about how to return your ballot. So you got to kind of sometimes think a little bit out of the box, reach out for help. And that's the other thing I was going to say at the front end, but I forgot, is that, again, we've mentioned states, well, even counties, there's counties like, again, Pinellas is one that's been doing it for years. But, you got states like Washington State and Oregon and Colorado who have very mature process. And those folks, believe me, they love to tell everybody else about how great mail balloting is and about how well to do it. Take advantage of those resources. There is no reason that for people that are just starting this process to reinvent the wheel. Number one, you don't have the time to be able to do it. But number two, people have thought through a lot of these things. What my experience has been is I've tried to take little nuggets from a bunch of different sources, because you can't take something whole cloth from somebody else and put your name on it and say, okay, this is what we're going to do here. But you're going to get, if you reach out, and believe me, election administrators around the country, my experience has been they're bend over backwards to help their colleagues. Across the board, ideological spectrum, geographic, doesn't matter. If election administrator calls, you're going to help them out if you can. So reach out, find out what other jurisdictions and states are doing, and use the case concept, copy and steal everything. Most of the people are more than happy to share it with you. But then again, you know, you've got these other cross currents as well, where some of the things that you would think, okay, this would be very good in order to be able to educate the voter, either statutorily you can't do it, or USPS comes in and says, hey, that design doesn't work because of our automation standard. So it's sort of a, you know, it's a little bit of a trial and error, but you got to do that trial and error on the front end as best as you can. So by the time you get to pulling the trigger on your final design and production and on getting those ballots out in the mail. The other thing I really want to think that, in my opinion, is very, very important is the time element also on the tabulation side. Florida allows for tabulation to start well in advance of Election Day, the processing of ballots. There's some states, I'm aware, that you can't even touch those ballots until after the polls close on Election Day. I quite frankly don't know how we would do that here in the state of Florida if we didn't have that opportunity to start processing those ballots. And again, very mature process. We've been doing it for years here in Florida. People say, well, how, you know, you're going to release results. Believe me, that's the last thing. It's never happened, number one. And number two, everybody has procedures in place to prevent that kind of thing from happening. So what happens here in our state, which is vastly different, I think, in a lot of other jurisdictions, is literally the state law says when the polls close at 7 p.m., within the first 30 minutes after the polls close, you as a county election official have to report all of your vote by mail ballots that you've tabulated up to then and all of your early votes. So again, hearkening back to the numbers, percentages, so within the first 30 minutes of our polls closing, you've got well over half the votes cast in the state, in the local jurisdiction, and collaboratively in the state are reported. And so then it's the election day and then whatever is uncounted out there. And I'm a big believer in the fewer number of ballots that are in play, if you will, after the polls close, the better. The more that can be done either on election day or in advance of election day and settled at that point, in my opinion, the better. So there's fewer ballots to argue about, if you will, after the polls close. If all of a sudden you have a close election, then you look at all of those 5% or 10% or 1% of ballots that are still left out there to litigate over, and everybody's making accusations back and forth. So again, my personal belief: the more you can get done on the front end, the better. And I think I think it's worked here in our state.
Well, thank you, David. So let's talk about the next thing I want to talk about is going a little bit back to preparation and execution. So what additional resources will offices need to utilize to handle more absentee and vote by mail? When I'm talking about supplies, envelopes, what should these offices be thinking about to sort of streamline their processes before launching into or anticipating more absentee or mail ballots?
Well, Commissioner, I will say that after Pinellas County orders all of what we need, then I encourage everyone to go out and get what they need.
Yeah.
That's a joke. The bottom line is that, again, I will say this as many times as I can: do as much as you can, as soon as you can. You need to reach out to your vendors. You need to reach out to your stakeholders that are a part of this process, and you need to get what you need as soon, at least let them know what you're going to need. Like, at a minimum, we will make contact with our printing, services, with our vendors, and at minimum, we're going to need 400,000 envelopes. And because the laws changed, I mean, the legislative session changed here in Florida in March, but that doesn't mean in every other state that's happened. So laws change. So the last thing you want to do is print something on instructions or on envelopes that now you have to throw away and start over. So at a minimum, reach out to, we have a county print shop through the county, which obviously affords us the opportunity to take advantage of saving money. But we will let them know months in advance that we're going to need 1 million pieces of purple paper. And we're going to need 1 million pieces of this color paper, so on and so forth, and envelopes through a different vendor to make sure that at a minimum we have the paper stock. We also reach out to Runbeck to let them know how much ballot stock we're going to need. So all of these things are in the pipeline long before the election even takes place. Because again, yes, this is a different circumstance leading into 2020's election with COVID. Pinellas estimated we were going to have over 300,000 mail ballot requests before we knew about COVID. So we've looked at our numbers, and we've decided that we needed to increase the stats that we anticipated, and we went back out to our vendors and up those numbers. So you definitely got to look at what who's involved in the process and make sure that they are involved and that they know what you need, and you have all of that ready to go, even if it's just paper stock, and then you can provide them the what you need to print on that paper stock at a later time. But get that paper stock, because it's a presidential election year. We're all having elections on the same day in November, and we're all going to need the same materials at the same time.
David, do you have any input on that?
Yeah, I mean, the capacity issue is real. As you know, I know that you've been on some of these phone calls of people that are looking at what does an increased, a surge, if you will, in vote by mail balloting look like? What can the suppliers out there, the supply chain, what can they handle? So I think a couple of things. One, if you're a jurisdiction that historically had a small number or a reasonable number, if you will, of vote by mail ballots that maybe, again, my point of reference here is precinct-based scanners and then central count scanners. So if you're a lot of jurisdictions I know out there don't have central scan because they either can't afford it or they can't really justify it because they historically had not had that volume that they could handle just by lining up a couple of precinct-based scanners, or so other states I know that send their vote by mail ballots out to the precincts to be tabulated there as well. But if you're going to talking about a surge, then you're going to need to look at, do you have the adequate equipment to be able to process, to tabulate those ballots? And I can tell you that I know, because we've had these conversations, that these equipment vendors, there's not a lot out there, right? And it's not like they've got a bunch of these things a bunch of central count scanners sitting on their shelves. That it's like going to Walmart and say, I'll take one of those or one of those. It's not that easy. There's a not to mention the procurement side on the purchasing side, all the regulations and the hoops that you have to go through to do that. So I think it's one of the things. Do you have the equipment to be able to handle the basic tabulation of those ballots? Much less, are you at a point where, like I talked about earlier, where we went from manual to automation? And again, that's not without cost. We ended up saving, I think, some labor costs at the end of the day. Well, I know we saved some labor costs, but being able to do that sort of in-house, are you reaching that level where it makes sense to go out and look at purchasing or leasing a folder inserter to be able to automate that process on the front end? And then on the back end, there's a handful of vendors out there that have equipment processing on the back end. There's the big equipment that folks like Pinellas and Miami-Dade and Orange County and LA County use, and then there's folks that do it manually, and then there's the folks like me that are kind of caught in between. We can't afford or justify one of these huge, robust, very, very expensive systems, but at the same time we need some automation on the back end. So there's some solutions out there as well, but again, don't have a bunch of them sitting on shelves as well. So looking at that sort of capacity, make sure you've got the labor involved as well. I mean, you're preparing, whether it's, as an alternative to that, you've got temporary employees that you can bring in to help again on the front end and the back end.
And if I can add one more, because I think we covered the vendors with the materials that you're going to need, the technology with processing with scanners and the mail ballot systems, the ballot on demand printing systems, in the staffing system that you need to consider. But lastly, I also think that you need to take into consideration storage. If you have millions of pieces of paper, you're going to have to store those securely. That's a given. Not only is it's expected by the voters, but it's usually in law. So you need to have facilities that have storage space, that have ballot lockers where you have camera devices, you have locking mechanisms, multi-factor authentication. You need to consider all the physical security concerns because you need to keep those ballots safe and secure. That's an expectation that not only voters have, but that we as administrators need to take into consideration and implement and make sure that those ballots are kept safely. You also need to have the space to manage all of this paper and all of these things. And so if you need to think of where are we going to open. If you're a small county and you double the size of your mail ballots, and then think of mail ballot requests, and then you think you go from a 1 card to a 2 card in a general election, you're not talking about 50,000 requests. Now you're talking about, in essence, 100,000 requests. How are you going to open those? How are you going to transport where you're opening the ballots to where you're tabulating the ballots, where those ballots are being kept safe? Now here in Pinellas County, our building was literally built to design. So we have an upstairs area where we have the mail system, the ballot lockers, the ballot opening area is all in one place. And then we have dumbwaiters where the ballots are sent down to the tabulation system, to the tabulation room where the ballots are stored. And then when we have to move the ballots back upstairs, you have sheriff's deputies and the canvassing board members who escort those materials back up to the ballot boxes. But you need to take into consideration also transparency. Mail ballots and the whole process needs to be transparent and open to the public. We need to take into consideration, where do we want to put people? And again, like I said, we're a building by design. Our canvassing board room has a public viewing room that's right outside of it. It's microphoned. It has a large TV screen that allows for the public to view the opening that's happening upstairs, along with a large drop-down screen that the canvassing board members can be present as ballots are being opened. So don't forget about the transparency portion of the process also, because just as much as early voting, a voter walking in and putting their ballot through the scan, everything is open, is out there for people to see my ballot was tabulated. Voters still have those options to come into our office while ballots are being tabulated and canvassed. They can come into our office and witness that, yes, my ballot is being counted and it is secure.
Julie, this is very helpful. The details are very important. To the viewers that are watching this, we do have a document that lays out all the different factors, and we call them swimming lanes, of vote by mail, timing, what procedures you might consider, and what equipment you might need. I highly recommend that the viewers go to that link and take a look at that on managing this process. Let's move on to question 6. I think we addressed this issue. I want to shift now to an area that we haven't talked a lot about. Julie, you did mention it a bit, and that's dealing with the post office, the third party in this. And what are some of the best practices and lessons learned Because if an office is going to have a larger number of mail ballots being processed, let's say they're moving from 5% to 25%, what are some of the best practices and lessons learned that they should, election officials should be aware of, and that they can sort of start thinking about now in dealing with the post office?
Yeah, the United States Postal Service is an integral part of the process. You cannot mail ballots and have ballots returned to your office without. You need to get with your regional coordinators and you need to work with them, have an open line of communication, give them your timelines. We actually have meetings where they come in and they meet with us. We review our materials, we review our envelopes. Again, like I said, we go to the actual mailing facilities with the U.S. Postal Services and we test our ballots through their Merlin system to make sure that everything is working properly. But we also take into consideration that they mail out a lot of things and they have to deal with a lot of pieces of mail. So we also encourage our voters to mail their ballots back a week prior to the election, which is a recommendation that the U.S. Postal Service asked election administrators to start a couple general elections ago. So we did that. And we encourage voters to also consider using our ballot drop-off locations. You got to get the Postal Service involved on the front end and work with them throughout the process, because without them, mail ballots, it could cause issues if you don't speak with them.
David, do you have something on this as well?
Sure. Yeah, there are a very integral part of the process. The thing that I think that I've learned over the years is that the experience from even within a state can be vastly different. Let me give you an example. We're blessed here in Pensacola to have a regional processing facility, literally that's 3 miles, I think, from our office. So a great example of this, when we had to change 2 of our polling places at the 11th hour in response to the COVID situation. We learned about the requirement in the morning. By say early afternoon, we had secured an alternative location. By the end of the day, we had printed letters for all of those voters within those precincts. Again, there was just 2 precincts. And by 5 o'clock, we had them to that regional postal facility. We know that the next day, voters were reading those, at least some voters were reading those letters that they've gotten from us, because we were getting phone calls about it. That experience is vastly different in talking to some of my colleagues, particularly, I think historically they're in Central Florida. And one of the reasons that actually the association, I wasn't a big fan of this because of my experience, but the association advocated for an earlier request deadline for vote by mails. It used to be, I think, 6 days before the election, and they moved that to 10 days before the election, because what was happening is they were getting requests towards the end of that deadline, knowing full well that their experience is by the time they got the request fulfilled, put that ballot in the mail to the U.S. Postal Service. I mean, to those individuals through the U.S. Postal Service. By the time it got to the voter, it was too late for that voter to actually return it. And so then there was this effort to say, we need to back it up, because these voters have an unrealistic expectation that they're going to be able to vote by mail if they're not even going to receive their ballot in time to be able to vote it by election day. So it's uneven, and I think that's just the nature of how the post office is set up. Again, I know how fortunate we are, and our folks here do a fantastic job of taking care of us and making sure that our mail, but they are an integral part. Again, the last thing that you want to have happen is that you find out after the fact that you have an issue with something, that a design issue with your balloting materials. So you want to, you've got these folks these design, well, I forget what MDAs, I think mail design people for the U.S. Postal Service, that literally you send everything to them. Sometimes you talk to two different people and get two different answers, but so be it. But at the end of the day, if you got a check mark on your materials, then you've got that, and you say, hey, we went through the process, we got it certified by the U.S. Postal Service, so we know it's good to go. So they're the very integral part, but part of the other is again that timing, timing. So the sooner that you send out those ballots to voters, the more time that they have to return those. And then one of the other things, again, I don't want to keep talking about Pinellas, but they were for Deb Clark was very aggressive early on in promoting alternative ways to return an individual's ballot, and through the use of drop boxes, and actually got into a little back and forth with the you may remember this, Don, with the state on that. But that's generally recognized across the country. If you look at large volume vote by mail states and jurisdictions, that people prefer to drop their ballots off versus putting them in the mail. So that's something that, say, Florida is sort of coming along, I think, a little bit slower than perhaps other states, and some people just aren't comfortable with that concept of dropping a ballot off. But those are the type of things that, because it does take time. The Postal Service, they've closed facilities over the years, and so it definitely takes more time than it used to. And so when you're relying, and particularly in a place like Florida, where you have that strict 7 p.m., it's got to be in our hands, not postmarked, in our hands by 7 p.m. The post office is a real important partner. And so the more you can do on the front end to ensure that the timing as well as the design issues are taken care of, the better. I'm here. Yeah.
So I think, when we talk about options for voters, not only do they have the post office, but if there's concern about getting their ballot back on time, they can return their ballot to a drop box, either at the polling place or at the election office. And those are options in many states, and I believe in Florida as well. Now,
not again, to be clear, not the polling place on election day. Their recently enacted legislation allows for the drop for dropping at a early voting location or a site that would otherwise be eligible as an early voting location, so long as it was manned. So yeah, but not on election day. If you're returning your ballot on election day, it's got to come back to the elections office and be in our hands by 7 p.m.
Great. For the last question, could we bring that up here? So are there any other last best practices that you would recommend or just reiterate, particularly with the situation we have with COVID-19 on handling a larger amount of mail ballots or absentee, depending on the state? I'll let each of you talk about that for a minute.
I think, if I may, I think the best practice when any jurisdiction is looking at a possible large increase in mail ballots is your staff is your best resource, along with, like David indicated earlier in the conversation, talking to other jurisdictions. Have team meetings, sit down with not just your top management, but folks who are part of the process. Sit down and talk it out. Talk about what are some of their concerns. Talk about how they could, there's so much to be gained from the folks who are a part of your day-to-day operations. I would highly suggest, we have more checklists than you can make, that you can even imagine. Every process that we conduct here in our office has some sort of checklist a procedure, utilize like these timeline technology software products that are out there. Make it so that you don't miss something. Nothing's going to be perfect the first go around, but try to mitigate error or mitigate the opportunity to miss something as much as possible by having meetings with your staff, talk things out, reach out to other jurisdictions, create checklists, create timelines, just utilize the best resource, which is your staff and the people around you. Because as election administrators, I've found that we all really want to help each other and do what's best for our voters. So we will do everything we can to help each other. And we're all in this together. The bottom line is we want to increase participation and turnout. And we want the voters to be comfortable with the process and know that their ballots, their votes are being counted, and that the process is secure and safe. And that's communication, that's transparency, you really need to hone in on that and make sure that folks know that mail ballots are a ballot option. It is literally bringing our representative democracy to their front doors. A voter only has to go to their mailbox, they can come back into their home and they can cast a ballot. And if you look at data, which is what we do, we don't make emotional decisions. We use, it's data-driven decisions, and voting by mail increases voter turnout and helps to manage election costs. And now you have this new part of the process where we're dealing with the pandemic. And this is a safe, viable option for voters to take advantage of if they want to think about safety for themselves, their families, and for others. And this is one of our lines that we use because it's true. In Florida, no matter how you vote, you're going to be using a paper ballot. So why stand in line? Why go to a polling place when you can have a ballot mailed to your home and you can vote in the comfort and safety of your home? And I think that is really important to this whole looking forward to 2020, not only for election administrators. Utilize your staff, sit down, put together a plan, and then execute that plan as efficiently as possible and communicate to your voters that mail ballots are an effective way to cast a ballot in an election.
Thank you, Julie. David, did you have some input on best practices, that we just discussed?
What she said. I'm just kidding. So as I mentioned earlier, there are a ton of resources out there. One of the things I wanted to mention, a fairly new document, I know that's been circulated in different forums, is this vote by mail project timeline that the the COVID-19 working group that's been established. Really good work in a short amount of time. Put this really great timeline. It's actually in an Excel format, so you can sort of adopt it. But throws down, as many procedures related to vote by mail as you can imagine, all on a single document with timelines. And I think again, time is your big thing that you cannot get more of. You can get more money, sometimes it's easier than others. But the one thing you cannot get more of is time. So each day as we get closer to the elections, the more and more critical it is. Particularly if this is something new, then the more time beyond what you would normally have to be able to prepare, the better. So again, reach out to others. There are folks, there are people that are passionate. There's groups out there like Vote at Home. Amber McReynolds, and she's doing a lot of great work out there. And believe me, loves nothing more than to talk about a vote by mail and the models that they that they promote. But there's lots of resources out there. Take advantage of them. Again, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You may have to modify it a little bit to fit in your particular situation or jurisdiction. But reach out, and then also just keep keep your eye on the clock. Those are probably the two biggest things that I would want to close with.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate you two coming on and talking about this issue. I hope that election administrators across the country appreciate it and can learn something from it and prepare for what might be a significant increase in absentee or mail voting. Thank you very much for participating. I appreciate that, and thank you again.
Thanks, Don.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks.